The sea smelled of salt and engine oil on that January morning when the empire began to crack. A gray transport ship rocked in the shallows of the Dutch East Indies, its hull groaning as Allied planes droned somewhere beyond the mist. On deck, a cluster of Japanese women clutched thin coats and canvas satchels, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where smoke from a bombed oil refinery curled upward like a black prayer. They had been teachers in distant missionary schools, clerks in shipping companies, nurses who once believed their work followed the divine light of the rising sun. Now they were fugitives in their own war, stranded between loyalty and survival. One of them, 24-year-old Kyoko Tanaka, pressed her palm flat to the cold railing. She had grown up in Yokohama, hearing her father speak of honor and death before surrender. In school, she memorized the imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, each word promising that capture was worse than shame. Yet here she stood, stomach empty, hands trembling, praying only that the aircraft overhead would not spot their retreat. Around her, other women whispered quick prayers to Shinto gods or clutched faded photographs of children left behind. The sea slapped the hull with impatient hands. The Allied offensive had come faster than anyone predicted. Java fell, the Philippines shook under MacArthur's return, and Japan's outer defenses crumbled. Civilians who had once arrived on these islands with crisp uniforms and imperial confidence found themselves suddenly unwanted, even hunted. Japanese propaganda had painted the enemy as brutal savages who tortured prisoners. Better to swallow a bullet than face that fate. But the women had no bullets, no weapons, no plan except to run and hope. By nightfall, they were captured on a dusty road outside Surabaya. A column of American and Australian soldiers, sweaty and dust-streaked, blocked their way with rifles slung low. The women froze. Some tried to bow, others fell to their knees. Kyoko's heart slammed against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst. In that moment, she expected a shot, or perhaps a shouted curse. Instead, a young GI, barely older than her younger brother, raised a hand and said in slow, unsure Japanese, "Stop. Safe now." The words were clumsy, but the tone was not cruel. Confusion rippled through the group like a sudden breeze. The soldiers searched them gently but thoroughly, confiscating knives and letters. They were ushered onto trucks, engines coughing into the humid night. Kyoko sat pressed between two strangers, a seamstress named Chio and a nurse called Etsuko, who stared at the canvas roof as if the stars might pierce through. None spoke. To be captured was already dishonor. To be alive might yet be worse. Somewhere behind them, a woman sobbed into her hands, repeating, "Gomen nasai, I am sorry," to no one in particular. Days blurred into each other as they were moved between makeshift holding areas. A Dutch colonial prison, then a guarded barracks near the harbor. They were fingerprinted, questioned, fed simple rations of rice and tinned meat. The interrogations were not the torture Japanese posters had promised. They were long, firm, but strangely polite. An American officer, his khaki uniform sweat-stained, asked about supply lines, nurses' stations, radio operators. Some women refused to answer, clinging to silence as the last scrap of dignity. Others, exhausted and hungry, mumbled fragments of truth. Each time Kyoko spoke, her voice cracking but steady, she felt something deep inside her shift, as if the pillars of childhood had begun to crumble. Nights were hardest. The women lay on thin mats, listening to geckos click on the walls and the distant rumble of artillery. Some prayed aloud. Others stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed, imagining family altars back home where their names might already be burned into incense smoke. Kyoko thought of her father's stern face and wondered if he would rather she were dead. She tried to summon the righteous fury she had been taught, but only a hollow ache came. When rumors reached them that Japan's navy had been crushed at Leyte Gulf, the room fell silent. One nurse whispered that perhaps the emperor himself might surrender. Another hissed at her to bite her tongue. but fear clung to them heavier than the tropical heat. For the first time, the invincibility of the Empire felt like a bedtime story told too long. It was during one of these restless nights that a small act of quiet rebellion occurred. Chio, the seamstress, produced a hidden scrap of chocolate, a gift from a sympathetic guard who had noticed her trembling hands. She broke it into uneven pieces, passing them around the room without a word. Kyoko held her shard like a relic before letting it melt on her tongue. It was the first sweet she had tasted in months, and it tasted of both shame and unexpected kindness. She did not know whether to cry or laugh. Soon after, an Allied officer informed them they would be transferred to a permanent prisoner of war camp. The announcement came with clipped efficiency, translated through a Nice interpreter. The words Geneva Convention floated over the group, foreign and almost absurd. Some women exhaled in relief. Others tightened their jaws. Kyoko felt neither, only a numb wonder that her life would continue, somehow, behind barbed wire rather than in a grave. On the morning of departure, they were marched to waiting trucks under a sky heavy with monsoon clouds. Local villagers watched in silence. Some spat, others looked away. The women kept their eyes on the ground, shuffling forward with a mixture of dread and relief. They did not know where they were going, only that it would be far from home and from the life they had lost. As the convoy rumbled out of the port town, Kyoko caught sight of a tattered imperial flag fluttering on a burned-out warehouse. For a heartbeat, memories surged. School parades, patriotic songs, her mother sewing armbands before she left for the islands. She had believed so deeply in the image of Japan as noble and unyielding. Yet here she was, alive but stripped of everything that belief promised. She turned her face away from the flag, unable to bear its gaze. The trucks rolled through jungled roads slick with rain. American soldiers rode alongside, boots muddy, rifles slung casually, talking among themselves in a language she only half understood. Once a soldier offered a canteen of water. Kyoko hesitated before sipping, the taste startlingly clean. The act felt both humiliating and strangely human. She wondered if kindness from an enemy was more dangerous than cruelty. It chipped away at the certainty that had kept her. Standing, when they finally reached the coast and saw the waiting ship that would carry them to an internment. Camp under American command, the women stood silently. No one wept, no one cheered. The sea breeze lifted strands of their hair, as if to remind them that freedom had shifted shape. They boarded with measured steps, each footfall heavy with unspoken fear. Kyoko paused at the gangway and glanced back one last time at the receding shore. Somewhere beyond those palm trees lay the graves of men who had chosen death over this shame. She was alive. For the first time, she questioned whether survival was betrayal or quiet defiance. A strange, guilty hope flickered, that perhaps beyond this surrender there might still be life. But as the ship's engines roared and the horizon opened wide, one truth tightened around her chest. Everything she had been taught about honor and enemy and nation was unraveling, and somewhere deep inside, a whisper rose. A question she dared not yet speak but could no longer silence. What if the enemy is not what we were told? Rain slicked the wooden pier when the women disembarked, the sky a low bruise over the harbor. Kyoko stepped onto American soil, or what felt like it, with knees weak and stomach hollow. She had braced herself for humiliation, for snarling guards and jeering crowds, but the dock was eerily quiet, save for the clatter of boots and the gulls circling above. Soldiers in olive drab moved with brisk efficiency, their faces unreadable, some curious, some merely tired. The smell of wet rope and diesel clung to the air. No one shouted. No one struck them. The silence itself felt dangerous, as if the cruelty had been hidden away, waiting. They were led into trucks once more, bumping along a road bordered by palms and ragged fields. The convoy wound toward a camp hidden beyond a ridge of scrub and sea wind. Barbed wire glinted at the top of tall wooden posts, But beyond it stretched neat rows of low barracks, painted a pale, almost welcoming beige. A watchtower stood sentinel, its lone guard chewing something and looking more bored than menacing. The scene was so at odds with the nightmarish warnings of Japanese propaganda that Kyoko felt her breath catch. She had pictured dungeons, whips, snarling dogs. Instead, she saw order. It frightened her more than chaos would have. Inside the gate, the women were divided into groups. Identification papers were checked, names copied into ledgers by clerks who barely looked up. They were given thin mattresses, blankets, and a quick orientation through a Nisei interpreter. A Japanese-American soldier with a soft California accent that sounded disorientingly familiar and foreign all at once. His name tag read Matsuda. He told them, quietly but firmly, that they were protected under the Geneva Convention. They would work, they would be counted, they would be safe if they obeyed the rules. The words slid into Kyoko's ears like something unreal, a promise she could not yet believe. The barracks smelled of pine and disinfectant. Narrow bunks lined each wall, stacked too high. Windows with wire mesh let in a dim coastal light. For the first time since capture, the women were left alone long enough to breathe. Chio sat heavily on her bunk, clutching the blanket as though it might dissolve. Etsuko leaned against the wall, eyes closed, muttering a prayer too faint to catch. Someone laughed suddenly, a dry, almost hysterical sound, and then clapped a hand over her mouth. The air felt brittle, full of things unsaid. That first evening, the camp mess hall served dinner. Bread, a slice of tinned peach, and steaming bowls of soup that smelled of chicken. The women approached the counter slowly, wary as deer. Kyoko had not tasted meat broth since before the invasion collapsed. She lifted the spoon to her lips and felt a strange warmth bloom, not just from the heat, but from the absurdity of kindness where cruelty was promised. Around her, some women wept quietly over their trays. Others ate in silence, eyes darting to the guards as if punishment might fall any moment. The next morning began with routine. A bell clanged at dawn, roll call in the open yard, guards counting heads with clipped precision. Work details were assigned: laundry, kitchen prep, groundskeeping. The rhythm of the camp revealed itself, strict but not sadistic. Soldiers watched but rarely barked. Orders were given without blows. The women kept waiting for the cruelty to surface. Days passed, and it did not. Instead, something stranger emerged. Small gestures of normalcy. A young GI named Miller, freckles bright against his sunburned face, showed Chio how to tie a more secure knot on a clothesline. An older sergeant scolded a guard for speaking too roughly. In the laundry shed, a gramophone sometimes played scratchy swing records. The women listened, bewildered, to horns and drums they had only heard in films. Each kindness was a crack in the wall of fear, and each crack hurt, because it contradicted everything they'd been taught. Breakfast became the quiet fulcrum of change. One dawn, after a long roll call under a pale pink sky, the mess hall served coffee and fried eggs alongside toast. The smell alone stopped the women mid-step. Coffee, dark, bitter, alive with a roasted sweetness they had almost forgotten. Eggs, bright yellow against the plate, their edges crisped with butter. Kyoko stared down at her tray, stunned. She remembered the rationed grains and watery miso of her childhood, the starvation stories from China. She took a bite, and the simple salt and fat flooded her senses with something like grief. Chio whispered hoarsely, "Heaven! It's heaven!" The phrase caught among the women, half joke, half prayer. Heaven on earth, coffee and eggs. That breakfast became legend within the barbed wire. It wasn't luxury by American standards, but to these displaced, frightened women, it felt impossibly abundant. It whispered a dangerous suggestion. Perhaps their captors were human. Perhaps survival could taste good. Each sip of bitter coffee clashed with the voice of their teachers and fathers, who had said Americans were monsters. Each swallow was a small act of unlearning. Still, shame lingered. Some women hid their enjoyment, turning their faces away as they ate. One refused the eggs entirely, mumbling about loyalty and honor. But hunger won more battles than ideology. Slowly, the tension around the mess tables softened. Conversations sparked, first about food, then about families, then about home. Kyoko listened more than she spoke, but she felt a thaw inside herself she hadn't expected. Evenings sometimes brought letters, heavily censored, but still lifelines. Kyoko received none. Her parents had no address for her now. But Etsuko got a thin envelope from a brother in the Navy. It was full of duty and coded love, warning her to keep strong. She read it aloud, voice trembling. They passed it around like contraband hope. Not everything was gentle. The camp was still a prison. Guards could be abrupt, searches invasive, and there was always the fence, high, coiled, gleaming in the sun. Rumors swirled of executions elsewhere, of POWs beaten in other camps. Fear never vanished. It only dulled at the edges, and dignity remained fragile. Many women flinched whenever an American camera appeared, terrified their faces would be paraded as shameful trophies back home. Yet something subtle shifted. Kyoko, once paralyzed by terror, began to observe the Americans with a careful, almost anthropological curiosity. She noticed how the young soldiers missed their homes. One traced a sweetheart's name in the dust on his rifle. She caught Miller humming lullabies under his breath while peeling potatoes. Humanity leaked through the armor of uniform and language. It unsettled her more than hatred ever had. One night, rain hammered the barrack roof while the women lay awake. Chio whispered into the darkness, "Maybe we were lied to." No one answered, but the silence was alive, trembling with a truth too dangerous to voice. Kyoko stared at the beams above, tasting coffee on her memory, and felt the scaffolding of her old beliefs sway. Days turned to weeks. The routine became life. Work, roll call, meals, letters, cautious friendships. But beneath it all ran a deep current of questions. Who were they now? These women who had survived what they were told was worse than death. What would Japan think of them if they ever returned? And what did it mean that the enemy's hands could feed instead of strike? Late one afternoon, as the sun bled gold across the yard, a guard posted a new notice on the message board. The interpreter read it aloud. More transports were coming, more prisoners. The war was turning. Japan was losing ground faster than anyone had admitted. A chill swept the yard. Kyoko felt it like a tremor through the soil. The empire's power eroding while she stood alive on the wrong side of the wire. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay listening to the rain guttering against the barrack roof, coffee's ghost still warm on her tongue, the scent of eggs lingering in memory. For the first time, she wondered if captivity might not be the worst fate, but the beginning of a reckoning she had never imagined. And somewhere in the dark came the quiet, dangerous thought she feared most. If the enemy can be kind, what does that make the war? And everything she was taught to die for. Morning in the camp began with the clang of a bell and the low murmur of boots on gravel. Mist curled across the yard like thin smoke as the women formed lines, counted, and dispersed to their duties. Life behind barbed wire settled into a rhythm that was neither freedom nor outright despair. A suspended existence. Kyoko scrubbed laundry in long troughs of gray water, the scent of soap cutting through the salt wind. Chio mended torn uniforms with silent precision. Etsuko tended to a small infirmary, bandaging splinters and fevers among prisoners and even guards when ordered. Each task dulled the hours, but also chipped away at the image of the enemy as faceless monsters. The camp's fences framed every moment. They gleamed silver under sun, dark under rain, a constant reminder that survival came at the cost of surrender. Yet within those boundaries, unexpected fragments of humanity seeped in. Guards sometimes lingered, curious, hesitant. Miller, the freckled GI, had begun learning words of Japanese. Awkward but earnest. He asked about names, about food back home. Once, he handed Kyoko a small pencil stub when he caught her staring longingly at paper. She used it that night to write a letter she could never send. A quiet act of defiance against forgetting herself. At dusk, the camp changed. Shadows stretched long between the barracks, and whispers rose. The women talked softly about the lives they had lost. A dress shop in Yokohama, a fiancé stationed in Manchuria, children left with grandparents. Some nights, laughter even slipped free, startled and brief, before shame followed close behind. Survival was not supposed to sound joyful. Kyoko learned to smile in the dark but kept her face still by day. Letters arrived sporadically, each a lifeline. Etsuko received one that spoke of shortages and bombings in Osaka. She read it aloud, voice trembling as she described air raids and charred neighborhoods. The women listened in stunned silence. Their homeland was suffering in ways they had not dared imagine. The idea that Japan might not win, that it might be burning, left a hollow quiet afterward. Kyoko felt the ground of certainty shift yet again. If victory was slipping away, what had their sacrifice meant? Rumors crept through the camp like smoke. Allied soldiers whispered about the Bataan Death March and starving prisoners of the Japanese army. Some of the Nisei interpreters told careful, hushed truths. Thousands of captured Americans and Filipinos had died under Japan's harsh treatment. The contrast struck like a blow. Here, the captives were fed, treated, even occasionally smiled at. There, their own army had offered no mercy. Kyoko felt a deep, confusing shame she could not name. Around the bunks, conversations turned heavy. Some refused to believe the rumors, others sat silent, eyes dark. Work sometimes brought the women into small, strange contact with their captors. Kyoko once helped repair torn mosquito netting with an American supply sergeant who hummed a song she later learned was called Sentimental Journey. Another time, Chiyo laughed despite herself when Miller tried, and failed, to use chopsticks at lunch. These encounters were fleeting but dangerous. Each one threatened to humanize the enemy, to blur lines once drawn in blood. Some women clung harder to pride, but others, like Kyoko, felt something more fragile, the slow erosion of hatred. The seasons shifted subtly. Rains came heavier, drumming the barracks roof at night, turning the yard to mud. The Americans built drainage trenches, and prisoners helped dig them. Work left hands blistered but hearts strangely light, with the simple purpose of moving water away from sleeping mats. Shared labor, however coerced, bred a thin, uneasy respect. Kyoko caught herself thinking of the guards not as demons, but as boys far from home, just like her. Still, the prison was no idyll. Punishment existed for infractions, solitary confinement for attempted escape, rations cut for disobedience. A young woman named Eiko was caught trying to climb the fence one humid night. She returned days later, thin and silent, eyes hollow. Fear rippled anew. No one forgot they were captives. But cruelty was not the foundation here. Survival was. And survival brought its own quiet revolution. The simple continuity of living, eating, working, laughing sometimes became subversive against a code that had demanded death. Kyoko wrestled with guilt each night. Her father's face haunted her. Better to die than dishonor. Yet she was alive, and part of her wanted fiercely to stay that way. That wanting felt like betrayal and liberation at once. One evening, Miller approached the laundry shed where Kyoko worked alone. He gestured shyly, offered a small wrapped package, a few instant coffee packets saved from his rations. She hesitated, heart pounding with fear of being seen, then accepted. The coffee tasted bitter, warm, achingly human. For a long time after, she stared at the fence and wondered if kindness could be more subversive than cruelty, if it could undo years of war faster than bullets. By mid-1945, the war's tide was unmistakable even inside the camp. Guards spoke in lower tones, radios crackled with news of island after island falling to the Allies. A Nisi interpreter told them almost gently that Tokyo had been firebombed to ash. The women sat stunned in the mess hall, bowls cooling in their hands. Some wept quietly. Others stared ahead, numb. Kyoko felt a strange mix of grief and relief. The Empire was failing, but maybe, somehow, that meant an end to all this. As surrender crept closer, an unspoken dread rose. Return. What would home think of them? Women who had not died, who had eaten enemy food, who had been touched by foreign kindness? Survival might not be welcomed. It might be branded shame. Kyoko felt the paradox coil inside her. She had lived, but living might cost her a place in the world she once belonged to. On a humid August night, lightning flared beyond the horizon. The rumor arrived quietly at first. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. The guards did not cheer. They stood silent, stunned. In the barracks, the women huddled together, unsure whether to cry or hide. Freedom was coming, yet it felt more terrifying than captivity. Kyoko pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own heart insist on life, and realized that the real battle was only beginning not with guns, but with what survival would mean when she finally stepped beyond the wire. The sea was calm the morning they left the camp, but Kyoko's heart thrashed like a trapped bird. Freedom had arrived not with fanfare, but with a terse announcement. The war was finished. Japan had surrendered, and they would be sent home. Trucks carried them once more to the harbor, passing fields shimmering under a hesitant sun. Guards who had once seemed unshakable now avoided their eyes, hollow with their own uncertainty. Miller stood near the pier, hat in his hands, freckles dim under the overcast sky. When Kyoko glanced back, he gave a brief nod. Not farewell, not welcome, just a human acknowledgement that they had shared something unnameable in a war, meant to divide. The ship smelled of rust and diesel, packed with returning prisoners, soldiers pale from captivity, nurses hunched in silence, civilians clutching meager belongings. Kyoko leaned on the railing as the horizon widened, trying to imagine the home she had not seen in years. She pictured her father's stern face, her mother's quiet strength, the streets of Yokohama she once knew. Yet unease shadowed every thought. Would she be seen as tainted? A woman who had lived under the enemy's mercy? She carried no visible wounds, but shame ran deep and invisible. Landfall was a shock. Japan was not the country she had left. The docks of Yokohama sprawled in rubble and smoke. Entire districts were flattened, blackened timbers jutting like broken teeth. The air smelled of ash and seaweed, of something scorched beyond recognition. Children with hollow eyes scavenged among ruins. Women in tattered kimonos queued for rations under the watchful gaze of American occupation troops. For a moment, Kyoko could not move. The empire that had demanded her death was gone, its grandeur reduced to debris. Home, when she reached it, was no refuge. Her family's house had survived, but barely. Walls patched with salvaged wood, garden gone to weeds. Her father sat thinner, older, gaze still hard. At first he said little. When she knelt and bowed, he remained silent long enough for the air to sting. Finally he muttered, "You lived." The words were not praise. They were accusation and bewilderment entwined. Her mother wept quietly behind him, but did not embrace her. Neighbors avoided her eyes. Some whispered. In a culture that had glorified death before dishonor, a returned prisoner and a woman carried a shadow. Kyoko found herself shrinking, moving carefully through the streets, listening to gossip about collaborators and weaklings. She said little of the camp, of the eggs and coffee, of the boy named Miller. Survival was safer unspoken. Chio fared worse. Her dress shop was gone, her relatives distant. She came to visit once, shoulders stooped, whispering that employers would not hire someone who had eaten the enemy's bread. Etsuko, who had tended wounds in the camp, returned to find her fiancé killed and her nursing license questioned. Each of them, scattered now across a broken city, learned that living had its own battlefield fought in stares, rumors, and self-doubt. Yet beneath the shame, something fragile endured. Kyoko began to write at night, filling cheap notebooks with memories she could not speak aloud. She wrote of the first cup of American coffee, of the fence gleaming wet with rain, of Miller's shy gift of paper. She wrote because she needed to understand what survival meant beyond disgrace. She wrote because she had seen the enemy's face, and it was not the monster she had been promised. As months passed, whispers of rebuilding rose alongside the ruins. American soldiers patrolled but also handed out food, medicines, and supplies. Children learned English songs. Merchants reopened blackened stalls. Life, stubborn and defiant, pushed through ash. Kyoko found work translating for an aid office quiet work, but a way to use the enemy's language she had overheard and half-learned. Each day she faced both gratitude and scorn from neighbors, but she kept going. She was learning to live without permission. One evening she walked along the waterfront where occupation ships docked. The air smelled of coal and salt. She carried one of her notebooks, full now with the story of the camp, unsure if anyone would ever read it. Watching the sunset bleed across the harbor, she felt a shift. The war had demanded her death, but she had chosen life, and in that choice lay a quiet rebellion stronger than any flag. She was not proud, not yet, but she was no longer ashamed. Behind her, a group of young Japanese boys laughed as they shared bread from an American soldier's rations. The sound startled her free, unafraid, alive. She turned and saw their faces lit by the setting sun, unaware of the weight their elders carried. For the first time, Kyoko felt the possibility of a future that belonged to survival, not ideology. She thought of the camp's fence, of nights spent wrestling with fear and guilt, of the morning coffee, whose steam had curled upward like a promise. Survival had not been cowardice. It had been the seed of something new, a life beyond hatred, beyond blind obedience. Her father's voice still echoed better death than shame, but another voice, softer yet stronger now, whispered back, better life, even if it means rebuilding from ruins. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the sea and distant cooking fires. Kyoko closed her notebook and stood still, steady against the gathering dark. She knew the world ahead would not welcome her easily. Scars of ideology and war would linger, but she also knew that the enemy she had feared had once given her warmth and food when her own nation would have let her starve. That truth could not be erased. Far out in the bay, a ship's horn sounded, long and low. It reminded her of departure, of the moment everything she believed began to break. Yet now the sound felt different, not defeat, but arrival. She turned toward home, shoulders squared against the dusk. Surviving had been her first rebellion. Telling the story, even if only to herself, would be the next. And somewhere within that telling, a new Japan one that might value life over blind death waited to be born.